The cemetery was veiled in a quiet serenity, its ancient oak trees standing tall, like silent sentinels guarding stories long forgotten. Sir Edric, a man of great stature, yet bearing the weight of a broken heart, visited his son Selim's grave every fortnight. The war that had claimed Selim's life had left Edric hollow, with only the sound of rustling leaves to accompany his grief. On one such somber morning, as Edric knelt by the gravestone, arranging wildflowers as he always did, something unexpected caught his eye. A boy no older than 10 stood a few feet away, holding his own bundle of flowers, his small frame trembling slightly in the morning chill. The boy was an enigma, a sharp contrast to the imposing figure of the Lord. He hesitated for a moment, placing the flowers gently upon Selim's grave, before stealing a quick glance at Sir Edric. Their eyes met, a fleeting connection sparking between the weathered face of the grieving father and the youthful innocence of the boy. But before Edric could utter a word, the boy turned swiftly, his small feet carrying him away as fast as they could manage. It was an image that etched itself into Edric's mind, a peculiar, almost otherworldly moment in an otherwise predictable routine. There was something hauntingly familiar about the boy. The way his shoulders moved, his cautious demeanor. It was as though Edric had seen him before in a memory he couldn't quite grasp. This fleeting interaction, so small and seemingly insignificant, stirred something in Edric. Compassion wrestled with curiosity, the need for answers clawing at the back of his mind. Why had this boy, a stranger, come to his son's grave? What story, what connection could possibly link him to Selim? As Edric stood there, staring at the bouquet left by the boy, he couldn't help but feel the weight of something more. The flowers were wild and untamed, a stark contrast to the meticulously arranged ones Edric had brought. They seemed symbolic, carrying a message or emotion that words might fail to convey. It was a reminder of life's fragility, a whisper of inspiration that perhaps even in the pain of loss, there was a story worth unraveling. The next time Edric visited the grave, he found himself scanning the cemetery, his sharp gaze darting between the tombstones. Was the boy a mere coincidence, or was there a deeper purpose to his presence? Questions piled up like fallen leaves, each one layering his sorrow with a growing sense of intrigue. The battlefield had taught Edric that nothing in life was random. Every action, every face had meaning. And yet, here he stood, lost in a mystery he couldn't shake. His mind wandered back to the days when Selim was alive, when his son's laughter filled the castle halls. The grave, though somber, was a place of connection, a fragile bridge between past and present. But this boy, this unexpected visitor, had disrupted that sacred solitude. Empathy began to bloom within Edric's chest, blending with the sorrow he had carried for years. He couldn't turn away from the curiosity clawing at him now. The whispers of the wind through the trees seemed to call out for answers, tugging at Edric's instincts. Could this boy hold a piece of the puzzle Edric didn't even realize was incomplete? The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the gravestones. But Edric lingered, his thoughts heavier than his armor. He would return to this grave, not just to mourn, but to discover what secrets might lie beneath the surface. Something about that morning lingered, refusing to fade into the recesses of his mind. It was more than an emotional story. It was a thread connecting Edric to something unknown, something larger. He had to find out the truth. The encounter opened a door he didn't know existed, and there was no turning back. The boy's footsteps faded into the distance, but the image of his face lingered in Sir Edric's mind. Who was this child, so bold yet fleeting, appearing out of nowhere to leave flowers at Selim's grave? The encounter gnawed at Edric's thoughts as he returned to his castle, the cold stone walls offering no solace. This wasn't mere coincidence. No, Edric had lived through too much to believe in chance. With his heart heavy and his mind ablaze, he summoned his most trusted knights the next morning. "Find the boy," he ordered, his voice echoing through the grand hall like a storm breaking over the sea. The knights, loyal and disciplined, asked no questions. But within Edric's chest, questions roared louder than thunder. Why had the boy fled? And what compelled him to come to Selim's resting place? The knights rode out, their capes trailing behind them like banners of war. Edric, meanwhile, paced the castle grounds, waiting, wondering. Compassion for the child mixed uneasily with suspicion, a volatile blend that made his usually sharp judgment feel clouded. Days passed, and still there was no sign of the boy. The cemetery was quiet as ever, the stillness mocking Edric's growing desperation. But then, one of his knights returned with news. The boy had been spotted at the edge of a nearby village, clutching wildflowers and disappearing into the woods like a shadow. "He's fast, my lord," the knight said, catching his breath. "But he's not invisible." Edric felt a flicker of relief. Relief and something else. Could this child be connected to his son in ways he couldn't yet fathom? Elias. That was the boy's name. The knights eventually learned from villagers who had seen him darting between trees and fields. A child of no great lineage, no lands or titles to his name. Elias lived on the outskirts of the village with an aging woman rumored to be his caretaker. The details were sparse, but Edric clung to them like a drowning man to driftwood. This boy, Elias, had invaded the sanctuary of his grief. And yet there was something about him, something that stirred not just questions but a strange, unspoken empathy. When the knights finally cornered Elias in the woods, he didn't fight, nor did he cry. Instead, he stood silent, clutching his bouquet of wildflowers with trembling hands, his eyes defiant but filled with fear. It was a sight that struck even the hardened knights, their battle-worn faces softening as they led him to the castle. Edric waited in the great hall, his towering frame casting a shadow that stretched long and ominous across the stone floor. When Elias was brought before him, the boy's smallness seemed amplified by the grandeur of the room. "What were you doing at my son's grave?" Edric asked, his voice measured but carrying the weight of a command. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the floor, his fingers tightening around the bouquet, as though it could shield him from the intensity of the Lord's gaze. The silence between them grew, thick and oppressive, until finally, Elias spoke. I was paying my respects," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't the words themselves that caught Edric. It was the way Elias said them, with a reverence and sorrow far beyond his years. There was something profoundly human in that moment, something that broke through the barriers of age, status, and grief. For a brief instant, Edric saw not a boy, not a stranger, but a soul weighed down by a story untold. He softened ever so slightly, though his questions still burned bright. "And why would you do that?" he pressed, leaning closer, his piercing gaze searching for a crack in the boy's resolve. Elias hesitated, his lips trembling as though caught between truth and fear. "Because," he began, but his words faltered, leaving a silence that begged for resolution. This wasn't just a mystery. It was the beginning of something deeper. A connection, perhaps, a bridge between the past and the present, forged by pain and empathy. But what that connection was, Edric couldn't yet see. All he knew was that the boy's story, whatever it was, would change everything. And as the knights looked on, their lord's expression uncharacteristically vulnerable, it became clear that this wasn't just about answers. It was about understanding, about compassion, and about the kind of inspiration that could only come from the most unlikely of sources. The air in the great hall was heavy, almost suffocating, as Sir Edric waited for the boy's next words. Elias stood before him, clutching his bouquet of wildflowers as if it held the strength he needed to speak. "Because he was my father," Elias finally said, the words escaping his lips like a confession long withheld. The hall fell silent. Even the crackling of the torches seemed to pause in reverence. Edric's breath caught, disbelief and recognition warring within him. How could this boy, so unassuming, carry such a claim? For a moment, Edric thought the child's words might be a lie, a desperate bid to gain favor or escape punishment. But when Elias looked up, his eyes brimmed with an emotion so raw, so unguarded, that Edric knew there was no deception here. Those eyes, dark and resolute, mirrored Selim's, and it struck Edric like a blade. Memories of his son's youth came rushing back, unbidden and unstoppable. The way Selim had carried himself, the quiet defiance in his stance. Elias was his shadow, his reflection his blood. "How can this be?" Edric demanded, his voice trembling despite his effort to remain composed. Selim never spoke of a child, nor of a woman. His words faltered as his mind raced through possibilities. Elias hesitated, glancing at the knights who loomed nearby. "It wasn't his fault," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight far beyond his years. "He didn't know. My mother, she didn't tell him until it was too late. He was already gone, and there it was, a truth that stung like an old wound reopened." The story poured out of Elias in fragments, each piece more heartbreaking than the last. His mother, a woman from a rival kingdom, had fallen in love with Selim in secret. Their union had been brief, but intense, a forbidden love that defied the hatred between their peoples. But before she could tell Selim of her pregnancy, the war had claimed his life. Fearful of retaliation and scorn, she had fled to the outskirts of the kingdom, raising Elias in obscurity. It was a tale of love and loss, of compassion tested by the cruelty of medieval history. As Elias spoke, Edric felt the weight of his own failings pressing down on him. Had he been so consumed by the war, so blinded by his duties as a lord, that he'd failed to see the depths of his son's struggles? Selim had carried the burden of forbidden love alone, a burden that now passed to his child. Edric's heart ached with empathy, a profound sorrow for a grandson he had not known existed. Yet alongside that sorrow came anger. Anger at the secrecy, at the choices that had kept this boy from his rightful family. The knights exchanged uneasy glances as Edric rose from his seat, his towering frame casting a shadow over Elias. "If what you say is true," Edric began, his voice low and steady, "then you are not just any boy. You are of my blood. You are a Callan." The words felt strange on his tongue, a mix of pride and uncertainty. Elias looked up at him, his small hands clutching the wildflowers even tighter. "I don't want anything from you," he said, his voice trembling. "I just wanted to know him, to feel close to him." Those words, so simple yet so profound, pierced Edric's heart like no sword ever could. This was not a child seeking wealth or status. This was a boy yearning for connection, for the memory of a father he never met. It was an emotional story unfolding before Edric's eyes, one that stirred compassion and a deep desire to right the wrongs of the past. And yet, the path forward was far from clear. How could Edric reconcile this newfound bond with the bitter history that divided their families? The hall seemed smaller now, the walls closing in as Edric wrestled with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He saw in Elias not just a grandson, but a second chance, a chance to honor Selim's memory and perhaps heal wounds that had festered for far too long. But the road ahead would not be easy. The truth of Elias's parentage was a spark, and Edric knew it could ignite a fire that would consume them all. Yet he couldn't turn away from it. He wouldn't. For the first time in years, Edric felt something beyond grief. He felt a purpose, a glimmer of hope that perhaps the tragedies of the past could give rise to something greater. But this hope came with its own burdens, its own questions. What would the revelation of Elias's lineage mean for the fragile peace between kingdoms? And could Edric find the strength to embrace this child, this living connection to his son, without losing himself in the process? The weight of Elias's revelation hung heavily on Sir Edric's shoulders, and though he was a lord of unyielding resolve, this truth struck at the core of his being. As he stared at the boy who carried his son's blood, he felt both pride and fury. Pride for the life that Selim had unknowingly left behind, and fury at the forbidden love that had entwined their fates with an enemy kingdom. These feelings waged war within him, leaving his mind restless and his heart torn. How could he reconcile the joy of having a grandson with the pain of Selim's untold struggles? Edric paced the halls of the castle for days, his thoughts a battlefield. His advisors, loyal but cautious, whispered of the political consequences of acknowledging Elias as his kin. To unite with a rival bloodline, even through a boy, could be seen as weakness, a betrayal of the sacrifices made in the war. And yet, every time Edric considered turning Elias away, the boy's face returned to his mind. The same fire that had burned in Selim's eyes was alive in Elias, a spark that Edric could not ignore. Compassion clashed with his sense of duty, leaving him trapped in a storm of indecision. In the quiet hours of the night, Edric found himself drawn to Selim's grave. He stood there, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the headstone, and spoke aloud to his son, as though he might still hear. "What would you have me do, my boy?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Would you want me to embrace him, or would you curse me for welcoming the blood of our enemies?" The grave offered no answer, only the rustling of the trees, but Edric felt a strange sense of peace in those moments. It was as if the grave urged him to listen to his heart. Meanwhile, Elias wandered the castle halls, a stranger in a world of grandeur and power. He was a boy of simple means, unaccustomed to the weight of lineage and legacy that now loomed over him. The knights watched him with curiosity, their expressions a mix of pity and suspicion. Yet Elias held his head high, his determination unshaken. He was not here for wealth or status. He had come for answers, for the connection he had longed for since he first learned of his father's name. His courage stirred something in those who observed him, a quiet inspiration born of resilience. Edric's inner turmoil grew with each passing day. His advisors urged him to send the boy away, to protect the kingdom's fragile stability. "You owe him nothing," they insisted, their voices cold and pragmatic. But Edric knew better. This wasn't about politics or power. It was about family, about the love he had lost and the chance to reclaim a piece of it. And yet, how could he embrace Elias without betraying the memories of those who had fallen in the war? His mind spun with questions, each one cutting deeper than the last. One evening, as the castle sat bathed in the glow of the setting sun, Edric called Elias to his chambers. The boy entered cautiously, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. "Do you understand what your presence here means?" Edric asked, his voice low but steady. Elias nodded, his eyes unwavering. "I understand that I am a reminder," he said softly, "of something you'd rather forget. But I am also a part of him, and I think you know that too." The boy's words struck Edric with the force of a blow, their simplicity cutting through his defenses. Elias's courage reminded Edric of the man Selim had been. Fearless, honorable, and full of compassion. The boy's presence was not a threat. It was a gift, a chance to heal the wounds that war had left behind. And yet, Edric could not shake the anger that lingered in his heart, anger at the forbidden union that had brought Elias into the world. This anger was a barrier, a wall between him and the grandson he so desperately wanted to know. Could he find the strength to let it go, to choose love over pride? The conflict within Edric was more than personal. It was symbolic of the tension between honor and empathy, between the demands of duty and the whispers of the heart. Every decision he had ever made as a lord had been guided by reason, by the cold logic of survival. But this was different. This was emotional, messy, and entirely human. It was a battle unlike any he had fought before, one that could not be won with swords or strategy. And as Edric looked at Elias, he knew the time for a decision was fast approaching. The castle was alive with whispers, the servants and knights exchanging glances as Sir Edric and Elias stood together in the great hall. It was a sight none had expected. The hardened lord, long defined by his grief and pride, beside the boy whose very existence challenged the foundations of his beliefs. Days of quiet contemplation had led Edric to this moment, and though his heart still bore the weight of anger and sorrow, a new emotion had begun to take root. Hope. Hope that the mistakes of the past might give rise to something greater. Elias, though small in stature, carried himself with a quiet dignity that struck even the most battle-worn knights. He spoke not with arrogance, but with conviction, his words a reflection of the father he had never known. "I don't want to divide your world," he said to Edric one evening, his voice steady yet soft. "I want to honor my father, And if that means earning my place here, I will. The boy's resilience stirred something deep within Edric, a compassion he hadn't felt since Selim's death. It was a reminder that empathy, even in the harshest of times, could bridge the deepest divides. The turning point came during a gathering of Edric's court. The lords and advisors, skeptical of Elias's place in their world, watched as the boy presented a simple yet profound gesture. He placed a single wildflower, a token of his humble beginnings, on the table before Edric. "This flower grew on the battlefield where my father fell," Elias said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "It grew where others saw only ruin. If life can rise from such loss, perhaps we can find peace too." The room fell silent, the boy's words cutting through centuries of enmity like a blade. Edric, moved by the boy's courage, rose from his seat. "This boy," he began, his voice steady and resolute, "is not a symbol of division. He is a bridge between the world my son fought to protect and the future we must now build." The words echoed through the hall, carrying with them a sense of finality. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the scars of medieval history might finally begin to heal. Edric's declaration was more than a statement. It was a vow, a promise to honor both his son's memory and the grandson who now stood before him. As days turned to weeks, the relationship between Edric and Elias deepened. The Lord, once so rigid in his ways, began to see the world through the boy's eyes. They walked the castle grounds together, sharing stories of Selim and discovering common ground in their shared grief. Elias, in turn, found inspiration in Edric's wisdom, learning not just the art of war, but the importance of compassion and leadership. Together, they forged a bond that transcended the barriers of blood and history, a bond built on understanding, forgiveness, and love. News of their reconciliation spread beyond the castle walls, reaching even the rival kingdom where Elias's mother had once lived. What began as whispers soon grew into discussions of peace, the unlikely union between Edric and his grandson serving as a beacon of hope. The kingdoms, long divided by war, began to explore the possibility of an alliance, inspired by the boy whose very existence had once been a source of conflict. It was a reminder that even the deepest wounds could be healed when empathy prevailed over pride. Edric, now an old man but with a newfound sense of purpose, made a decision that stunned his court. He shed his armor, both literal and metaphorical, stepping away from the burdens of war to focus on rebuilding his family and his legacy. He donated his wealth to the villages ravaged by conflict, his actions a testament to the belief that true power lay not in domination but in connection. It was a lesson he had learned from Elias, the boy who had reminded him of what truly mattered. As the seasons changed, so too did the kingdom. The tale of Edric and Elias became a story sung by bards, a legend passed down through generations. It was a story of loss and redemption, of forbidden love and unexpected bonds. And though the world continued to change, the memory of their journey remained, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of family. Standing together in the castle courtyard, Edric and Elias looked out at the horizon, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. But the future still held questions. Questions about the challenges their newfound peace would face and whether the reconciliation of two worlds could truly endure. And as the sun set over the castle, casting long shadows across the stone, Edric knew that their story was far from over. It was only the beginning of a legacy that would shape the generations to come.